Oh, I almost forgot that this is the bonus part of the timeline. He included over 5,000 events from parts 1 to 68, but now, he did not include the number of century at the top, so I guess today's part is about centuries. If anyone did not know what the term century is, I'll explain it to you. Century is a period of 100 years, and the term century came from the French word cent, which means 100. But that would be a lot of centuries, so we're skipping to 40th century BC. 40th century BC, 4000 BC to 3901 BC. 39th century BC, 3900 BC to 3801 BC. 38th century BC, 3800 BC to 3701 BC. 37th century BC, 3700 BC to 3601 BC. 36th century BC, 3600 BC to 3501 BC. 35th century BC, 3500 BC to 3401 BC. 34th century BC, 3400 BC to 3301 BC. 33rd century BC, 3300 BC to 3201 BC. 32nd century BC, 3200 BC to 3101 BC. 31st century BC, 3100 BC to 3001 BC. 30th century BC, 3000 BC to 2901 BC. 29th century BC, 2900 BC to 2801 BC. 28th century BC, 2800 BC to 2701 BC. 27th century BC, 2700 BC to 2601 BC. 26th century BC, 2600 BC to 2501 BC. 25th century BC, 2500 BC to 2401 BC. 24th century BC, 2400 BC to 2301 BC. 23rd century BC, 2300 BC to 2201 BC. 22nd century BC, 2200 BC to 2101 BC. 21st century BC, 2100 BC to 2001 BC. 20th century BC, 2000 BC to 1901 BC. 19th century BC, 1900 BC to 1801 BC. 18th century BC, 1800 BC to 1701 BC. 17th century BC, 1700 BC to 1601 BC. 16th century BC, 1600 BC to 1501 BC. 15th century BC, 1500 BC to 1401 BC. 14th century BC, 1400 BC to 1301 BC. 13th century BC, 1300 BC to 1201 BC. 12th century BC, 1200 BC to 1101 BC. 11th century BC, 1100 BC to 1001 BC. 10th century BC, 1000 BC to 901 BC. 9th century BC, 900 BC to 801 BC. 8th century BC, 800 BC to 701 BC. 7th century BC, 700 BC to 601 BC. 6th century BC, 600 BC to 501 BC. 5th century BC, 500 BC to 401 BC. 4th century BC, 400 BC to 301 BC. 3rd century BC, 300 BC to 201 BC. 2nd century BC, 200 BC to 101 BC. 1st century BC, 100 BC to 1 BC. Like I said, there's no 0 BC nor 0 AD nor 0th century. 1st century, 1 to 100. 2nd century, 101 to 200. 3rd century, 201 to 300. 4th century, 301 to 400. 5th century, 401 to 500. 6th century, 501 to 600. 7th century, 601 to 700. 8th century, 701 to 800. 9th century, 801 to 900. 10th century, 901 to 1000. 11th century, 1001 to 1100. 12th century, 1101 to 1200. 13th century, 1201 to 1300. 14th century, 1301 to 1400. 15th century, 1401 to 1500. 16th century, 1501 to 1600. 17th century, 1601 to 1700. 18th century, 1701 to 1800. 19th century, 1801 to 1900. 20th century, 1901 to 2000. 21st century, 2001 to 2100. 22nd century, 2101 to 2200. 23rd century, 2201 to 2300. 24th century, 2301 to 2400. 25th century, 2401 to 2500. 26th century, 2501 to 2600. 27th century, 2601 to 2700. 28th century, 2701 to 2800. 29th century, 2801 to 2900. 30th century, 2901 to 3000. 31st century, 3001 to 3100. 32nd century, 3101 to 3200. 33rd century, 3201 to 3300. 34th century, 3301 to 3400. 35th century, 3401 to 3500. 36th century, 3501 to 3600. 37th century, 3601 to 3700. 38th century, 3701 to 3800. 39th century, 3801 to 3900. 40th century, 3901 to 4000. 41st century, 4001 to 4100. 42nd century, 4101 to 4200. 43rd century, 4201 to 4300. 44th century, 4301 to 4400. 45th century, 4401 to 4500. 46th century, 4501 to 4600. 47th century, 4601 to 4700. 48th century, 4701 to 4800. 49th century, 4801 to 4900. 50th century, 4901 to 5000. 51st century, 5001 to 5100. 52nd century, 5101 to 5200. 53rd century, 5201 to 5300. 54th century, 5301 to 5400. 55th century, 5401 to 5500. 56th century, 5501 to 5600. 57th century, 5601 to 5700. 58th century, 5701 to 5800. 59th century, 5801 to 5900. 60th century, 5901 to 6000. 61st century, 6001 to 6100. 62nd century, 6101 to 6200. 63rd century, 6201 to 6300. 64th century, 6301 to 6400. 65th century, 6401 to 6500. 66th century, 6501 to 6600. 67th century, 6601 to 6700. 68th century, 6701 to 6800. 69th century, 6801 to 6900. 70th century, 6901 to 7000. 71st century, 7001 to 7100. 72nd century, 7101 to 7200. 73rd century, 7201 to 7300. 74th century, 7301 to 7400. 75th century, 7401 to 7500. 76th century, 7501 to 7600. 77th century, 7601 to 7700. 78th century, 7701 to 7800. 79th century, 7801 to 7900. 80th century, 7901 to 8000. 81st century, 8001 to 8100. 82nd century, 8101 to 8200. 83rd century, 8201 to 8300. 84th century, 8301 to 8400. 85th century, 8401 to 8500. 86th century, 8501 to 8600. 87th century, 8601 to 8700. 88th century, 8701 to 8800. 89th century, 8801 to 8900. 90th century, 8901 to 9000. 91st century, 9001 to 9100. 92nd century, 9101 to 9200. 93rd century, 9201 to 9300. 94th century, 9301 to 9400. 95th century, 9401 to 9500. 96th century, 9501 to 9600. 97th century, 9601 to 9700. 98th century, 9701 to 9800. 99th century, 9801 to 9900. 100th century, 9901 to 10,000. The list is endless. It keeps on going. We currently live on the 21st century, and on the third millennium. Oh, and if anyone didn't know about the term millennium, I'll explain it to you. Millennium is a period of 1000 years, and it came from the French word mille, which means 1000. Oop. He didn't include the rest of the events for 2018, 2019, 2025, and 2026, so the missing events would include in the next part of the bonus. So stay tuned for the bonus part.